Everyone thinks they know how love stories begin, but mine started with attacks on my faith. He used to say God was just an invention. Instead of arguing back, I simply prayed, quietly. And maybe that's the most unexpected part, not trying to convince, but letting God do the impossible. My name is Mariah Whitaker. I'm 26 years old, I live in Scottsdale, Arizona, and I work with the youth at the church my father leads. I never imagined an atheist millionaire businessman would cross my path, let alone that one day he would fall to his knees in front of the entire congregation. If you think some people will never change, maybe this story will make you think differently. Growing up in Scottsdale, Arizona, felt like living in one of those towns where everyone knows your name, and also your parents, your grandparents, and even the family dogs. My father, Pastor William Whitaker, has always been a respected figure, not just from the pulpit, but also through conversations at the church door and visits to people's homes. My mother, Eleanor, is the kind of woman whose prayers make you feel like heaven itself stops to listen. I grew up in this environment of steady faith, where every day carried a new story of how God was working in people's lives. Being a pastor's daughter comes with its own unique challenges. For example, I learned early on that people expect you to be the example as if you could never make mistakes. But I also learned that faith isn't built only on perfect behavior. It's shaped through real stories, filled with highs and lows. I watched my parents spend nights praying for families in our community, and many times for our own as well. That blend of responsibility and love shaped the person I am today. I remember waking up early on Sundays to the smell of fresh coffee and homemade bread, while my mom was already setting everything up to welcome visitors after church. It was more than just a routine, it was a quiet testimony of hospitality and care. Sometimes I complained, wishing I could have a normal Sunday like my school friends, but over time, I realized that rhythm was part of my story and part of what God was building in me. Scottsdale isn't just desert and heat, like so many people think. It's a place of contrasts. Luxury neighborhoods next to modest ones, business owners and farmers sharing the same coffee shop. It was in this setting that I learned the importance of seeing people without judgment, because you never know what silent prayer someone might be whispering behind a smile. That lesson has stayed with me more than I ever expected. I grew up hearing my dad preach about grace, but it was around our kitchen table that I truly came to understand what it meant. Once he told me, "Mariah, God writes amazing stories even in the chapters that seem to make no sense." That line stayed with me, and to this day, when I look at my life, I see how every detail was carefully woven together by him. Maybe that's why I developed this habit of paying attention to the little signs, those coincidences that deep down you know are answers to prayer. What I didn't know was that one of those signs was about to completely change the course of my life, and that it would begin with a meeting as unlikely as a cactus blooming out of season. I don't usually believe in accidents when it comes to meeting people, but I have to admit, that day felt like God was setting something up, even though I had no idea what it was. I was helping my mom at a church fundraiser, arranging tables and serving coffee, when a tall, well-dressed man with the look of someone who had seen the whole world walked through the door. His name was Christopher Hargrove, and honestly, my first thought was, he doesn't belong here. Chris hadn't come to hear a sermon. He was there because of a business friend, James Thornton, who had insisted he stop by the event. Right away, I could tell he carried a skeptical air, the kind of gaze that scans everything, almost looking for flaws. He didn't smile easily, and his whole demeanor felt almost like a challenge, as if to say, "Prove to me this makes sense." The irony was, I wasn't even trying to prove anything. But something inside me told me this meeting wasn't random. Our first conversation was, at best, uncomfortable. As I poured him a cup of coffee, he made a remark about how these religious gatherings were a waste of time. I took a deep breath, smiled, and simply replied, Well, some people here would say it's the best investment of their lives. It wasn't a debate. It was just me reflecting what I believed. He gave a half smile, almost as if he found the answer naive but somehow endearing. After that brief exchange, we kept running into each other at other events, always by coincidence, or maybe by providence. He seemed to enjoy challenging me with philosophical questions and comments about science and religion. I, on the other hand, saw it as a quiet challenge of my own. How far could I go in showing my faith without turning it into an argument? After all, I had learned early on that sometimes the most powerful testimony isn't what you say, it's how you live. What struck me most, though, was that beneath all the skepticism, there was something about him that intrigued me. Maybe it was the way he listened. Even when he disagreed, he paid attention. Or maybe it was the shadow in his eyes, like he carried questions he had never dared to say out loud. I didn't know it then, but there was more to his story than anyone in that room could have imagined. And so, without even realizing it, a millionaire businessman and a pastor's daughter began sharing moments that, to anyone else, looked like pure coincidence. But I already knew, when God decides to write a story, he doesn't waste a single chapter. And I was about to discover just how far this one would take me. Over time, it became clear that Chris didn't just want to talk. He wanted to prove a point. Whenever he could, he would throw out lines like, "If God really exists, why is the world like this?" Or, "Faith is just a crutch for people afraid of reality." I'd heard arguments like that before, but coming from him, they felt like a personal mission to dismantle everything I believed. It was as if every conversation was a testing ground, and my faith was the main target. I won't lie. Sometimes I left those conversations exhausted. It was like trying to hold sand in your hands. No matter how tightly you grip, some always slips through. But then I remembered what my dad used to say. "Mariah, when someone attacks faith so hard, it's usually because they're wrestling with something much bigger inside themselves." That thought helped me see Chris not as an opponent, but as someone in process. There was one dinner where he was even more direct. He looked at me and said, "If I gave you all the evidence that God doesn't exist, would you admit you're wrong?" I smiled and replied, "Chris, if God didn't exist, you wouldn't be here trying to prove he doesn't. You're only fighting against something you secretly know is real." He stayed silent for a few seconds. I don't know if I made him reflect or if he simply didn't have an answer, but that pause spoke volumes. I began to understand that what bothered Chris most wasn't my faith, but my calmness and holding on to it. He came at me with theories, provocations, even sarcasm, yet none of it shook my balance. I think that intrigued him, and maybe even frustrated him. Deep down, he wanted to see if there was a weak point, a moment when I would admit I doubted God. Instead of getting into endless arguments, I chose strategic silence. Not the silence of someone with nothing to say, but the silence of someone who knows certain answers aren't given in words, but through a life of testimony. It was almost like I was saying, "I don't need to convince you, Chris. God will do that." And strangely, that seemed to affect him more than any argument I could make. I didn't know it yet, but I was entering a kind of battle that couldn't be won with logic, only with prayer. And that silent war was about to completely change the course of this story. It was at this point that I realized arguing with Chris was like trying to put out a fire with gasoline. The more I tried to reason with him, the more he closed himself off. So I made a decision that would change everything. I stopped trying to convince him with words and started interceding for him in silence. It wasn't easy. My first instinct was to respond to every provocation, but I knew God worked best when we gave him space to act. I began including Chris in all my prayers, even without him knowing. Sometimes in the middle of the night, I would wake up with his name on my mind and kneel by my bed. I asked God to reveal himself to Chris in such a clear way that no doubt could remain. I didn't pray for him to believe because of me, but that he would have a personal encounter with the Creator. I remember one afternoon while washing dishes, I started praying for him. It was so spontaneous that I realized God was teaching me to pray without ceasing. With each prayer, my faith grew stronger because even without seeing any changes, I knew something was happening in the unseen. It was like planting seeds in dry soil. You don't see anything on the surface, but you know the roots are moving below. I also learned not to underestimate small acts. Instead of debating, I chose to show patience, compassion, and respect, even when he was sarcastic. Sometimes simply listening without interrupting was a way of showing that my faith was strong. Those small gestures, as insignificant as they seemed, were part of my living prayer. A prayer expressed not only on my knees, but through my actions. Curiously, he started to notice. "You never lose your calm, do you?" he said one day, almost like an accusation. I just smiled and replied, "I'm not fighting alone." He didn't understand the depth of that sentence at the time, but I knew it would echo in his mind. Sometimes a simple phrase is like a seed planted in the heart, germinating at the right moment. And so, between conversations, silences, and prayers, I continued to believe that God was doing something much greater than I could see. I just didn't realize that soon subtle signs would start appearing, signs showing that the impossible was beginning to move. The first signs weren't obvious at all. Chris still had that confident attitude, sharp opinions, and skepticism at the ready. But suddenly, he started asking different questions. They were no longer about proving that God didn't exist, but about understanding why people trusted him so much. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I knew that this kind of change doesn't happen by accident. One time, he told me he had spent the night thinking about something I said weeks earlier. "You're only fighting against something you know is real." He mentioned it casually, as if it didn't matter, but I could tell it was working in his heart, quietly. Sometimes God plants a word so deep that even without realizing it, a person begins nurturing it with their own questions. Another curious detail was seeing him volunteer to help at a charity event. He said it was just to help James, but I knew, deep down, he was experiencing a bit of that spirit of service we often talked about at church. It was amusing to watch him try to keep a distant posture while carrying boxes of groceries for families in need. Small gestures like that say far more than he imagined. I also noticed that he started listening more. Before, he would interrupt any sentence that mentioned faith or God. Now he stayed quiet, watching carefully. It wasn't agreement yet, but it was openness. And for anyone who understands prayer, that's one of the clearest signs that something is moving. Faith, after all, begins with listening, even when the person doesn't realize it. Even in text messages, there was a difference. Before, conversations were short, direct, and full of provocations. Now, every once in a while, he would send a, "How's your day?" or "Good luck at service today." Small words, but to me, they were like hidden notes saying, "I'm starting to care about what you believe." I could feel God weaving something in his heart, stitch by stitch, like preparing a tapestry. But there was still one central piece missing, and it would appear in the most unlikely setting, a hotel room, far from home, where he would be alone with his thoughts. Chris was traveling for work in another city, staying at one of those luxury hotels that seemed to have everything except true company. He had just closed a $1 million deal, but later he told me he felt a strange emptiness, like he was celebrating alone in a huge, silent hall. It was there, in the middle of comfort and loneliness, that something began to happen. He said that night he couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned, changed positions, turned the TV on and off. Everything felt irritating. Then, without knowing why, he opened the drawer of the nightstand and found a Bible. He laughed to himself, thinking, of course, the very book I criticized the most. But for some reason he couldn't explain, he opened it. The pages fell open to the book of John, chapter 14. Do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. He said he just froze, staring at the words as if they were speaking directly to him. He remembered all the times he had seen me praying, and for the first time he asked himself, what if I'm wrong? Chris later confessed that he began to cry, something he hadn't done in years. Silent tears, as if each drop was washing away a bit of the arrogance and resistance he had carried. In that hotel room, with no background music, no preacher, no audience, he spoke to God for the first time. If you really exist, I need to know. There were no flashing lights, no audible voice, but he said he felt a peace so strong it seemed to fill every corner of the room. It was as if the weight he carried had been lifted from his shoulders. Deep down, he knew he could no longer claim that God didn't exist. Something had changed, irreversibly. The next morning, he woke up different. He didn't yet know what to do with it, but he was certain he couldn't just go back to his old life. And I, unaware of anything at the time, kept praying, never imagining that my prayer had already been answered that very night.
When Chris returned to Scottsdale, something about him was different. It wasn't immediately explainable, but you could feel it. His tone was softer, his gaze calmer. He still carried that confident posture, but now there was a quiet humility, as if he had realized the world didn't revolve entirely around him. The first time we met after his trip, he asked if he could attend church on Sunday. I thought he was joking, but he was serious. During the sermon, I kept an eye on him from the corner. He paid attention, followed along in the Bible, and at times seemed to hold back tears. It was hard to believe this was the same man who had once said that church was a waste of time. Over the following weeks, the changes became more noticeable. He started asking questions about faith, not to provoke, but to learn. He wanted to know about prayer, about Bible passages, and even asked for recommendations for Christian books. I suggested he start with The Pilgrim's Progress, and he devoured it in just a few days. That showed me his thirst was real. At work, according to James, Chris was more patient with employees and less obsessed with immediate results. He began funding social projects without publicizing anything, something unthinkable for a man who had once loved showing off his achievements. These small actions revealed that the transformation wasn't only internal, it was already overflowing into the way he lived. One day, over coffee, he said to me, "Mariah, I realize I've spent my whole life chasing things that don't satisfy. Now I feel like I found what I was looking for without even knowing it." I smiled, knowing that this was the essence of every true testimony, the discovery that only God can fill the space that nothing else can. And as I watched this new version of Chris, I had no idea that God was still preparing a public, surprising moment. Something that would not only mark our story, but also touch the lives of the entire congregation.
It was a seemingly ordinary Sunday, or at least it seemed that way. The church was full, the worship had just ended, and my father, Pastor William, was getting ready to start the message. That's when Chris stood up, walked to the pulpit, and asked to speak. I froze in my seat. I had never seen him so serious, and at the same time, so certain of what he was about to do. He took the microphone, looked at the congregation, and began telling his story. He spoke about how he had arrived there believing in nothing, how he had tried to convince me that God didn't exist, and about that night in the hotel room. I saw tears in the eyes of people who knew the old Chris well. His sincerity cut through any resistance. Then he turned to me in front of everyone and said, "Mariah, you were patient when I just wanted to argue. You prayed for me when I didn't even know I needed it.
And because of that, and most of all because of God, I'm here transformed. Today, I want to ask you to walk with me for the rest of our lives. My heart skipped a beat. The entire church went silent for a moment, and then erupted in applause and tears. My father, moved, stepped down from the pulpit and hugged us. It was as if that moment was the perfect chapter for a testimony God had been carefully writing all along. The most beautiful part was seeing that the proposal wasn't just a romantic gesture, but a public act of faith. Chris was telling everyone, and God, that he wanted to build a life not only by my side, but at the center of God's will. And to me, that meant more than any ring or lavish celebration. I had no idea that this moment would be just the beginning of a new calling God had for us, a calling that would go far beyond our marriage and touch lives we never imagined reaching.
In the months that followed, life seemed to take on new colors. Our wedding wasn't just a celebration of love, it was a living testimony that God still makes the impossible possible. At the altar, I looked at Chris and remembered every silent prayer, every conversation that seemed to go nowhere, and realized that it had all been worth it. After the honeymoon, we began serving together in ministry. Chris, who had once mocked any church activity, was now leading projects to help families and vulnerable situations. I focused on counseling women while he dedicated himself to mentorship and purpose-driven entrepreneurship initiatives. It was incredible to see how God had redirected every one of his talents. Scottsdale also began seeing us differently. People who knew Chris's past would approach and ask, "What happened?" And that's when he, with a smile, would tell them about his encounter with God in the hotel room. Some listened intently, others stayed quiet, but everyone left with something to think about. Life together brought its challenges, of course. We didn't always agree on everything and had to learn to align dreams, finances, and priorities. But we always returned to the same point: prayer. We knew that the same God who had brought us together could sustain our story, even when circumstances tried to pull us in different directions. Over time, our testimony began to reach beyond the church walls. We received invitations to share our story at conferences, podcasts, and even local TV interviews, not because we were special, but because people connect with real stories where faith and perseverance meet. And so, with each new opportunity, we kept writing this chapter together, a chapter that God is still unfolding. Deep down, I know, this story is far from over, because when God chooses to be the author, every page becomes a surprise, and I can't wait to see what comes next. Maybe there's someone in your life who seems impossible to change, but have you truly placed that person in God's hands? How many times have you tried to convince, argue, or debate? And what if instead you simply prayed? Today, when I look back, I realize that every prayer, even the quietest ones, were seeds that God made bloom at the right time. I'm Mariah Whitaker, and I'm grateful for this space on the Faith Story channel to share how God wrote my story. Now, I want to hear yours. Share your testimony in the comments. You never know who might be touched by it. And if you want to keep hearing real stories of faith that show that the impossible is just the beginning, subscribe to Faith Story. Here, every week, you'll find inspiration, hope, and living proof that God is still at work.